February 1946. Tokyo, Japan. The war was over. But inside the headquarters of the Allied occupation forces, something happened that left an entire room frozen in silence. American guards stood along the walls. Japanese officers sat in neat rows. Military translators waited beside their desks. The meeting was supposed to be simple, respectful, orderly. Instead, it became one of the most uncomfortable moments anyone present would ever remember. When the doors opened, several senior Japanese officers entered the room. The Americans expected what had become standard protocol since the surrender. A bow. A simple acknowledgement. A sign that the imperial military accepted the reality of defeat. But it never came. The officers walked forward. Stopped. And remained standing perfectly straight. No bow. No gesture. Nothing. The room immediately felt different. Captain Robert Hayes glanced at Major William Turner. Neither man spoke. But both knew exactly what had just happened. Across the room, translators exchanged nervous looks. One American sergeant quietly whispered, "Did they just refuse?" Nobody answered. Because everyone had seen it. And everyone understood what it meant. The war might have ended months earlier. But pride was still alive. And now the tension was beginning to grow. The Japanese officers remained calm. Their expressions never changed. They stood with the same discipline they had shown throughout years of war. Some looked directly ahead. Others stared at the floor. Not one appeared nervous. That only made the situation worse. Captain Hayes finally stepped forward. "Is there a problem?" The translator spoke. The senior Japanese officer listened. Then replied. The translator hesitated. For a moment he seemed reluctant to repeat the answer. "What did he say?" Hayes asked. The translator swallowed. "He says they are officers of the Emperor." Silence. "And?" "He says they will cooperate fully with occupation authorities." Hayes frowned. "But?" The translator looked down. "He says bowing is unnecessary." Several American officers shifted uncomfortably. A few soldiers exchanged glances. The atmosphere inside the room became heavier. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody made threats. Yet everyone could feel the challenge hanging in the air. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't open resistance. But it wasn't respect either. Word spread quickly through headquarters. Within hours the story moved through multiple levels of command. Staff officers discussed it. Intelligence officers analyzed it. Occupation administrators debated it. Some believed it was a harmless cultural misunderstanding. Others disagreed. One colonel slammed a report onto his desk. "They know exactly what they're doing." Another officer shook his head. "Or maybe we're reading too much into it." "What if we're not?" The argument continued late into the evening. Nobody could agree. The next morning, additional meetings produced the same result. The Japanese officers arrived. They were polite, professional, cooperative. And once again they refused to bow. The Americans became increasingly frustrated. Not because of the gesture itself, but because of what it represented. The occupation depended on stability. Stability depended on respect. And respect depended on both sides accepting a new reality. Yet something remained unresolved. Something invisible. Something emotional. Sergeant Thomas Reed later described the atmosphere. It felt like everybody was waiting for a storm. The reports continued moving upward. Eventually they reached the highest levels of occupation command. And finally, they reached the desk of the man responsible for rebuilding post-war Japan. General Douglas MacArthur. The room fell quiet when his aides entered. Senior officers gathered around a long conference table. Documents were stacked neatly. Nobody joked. Nobody spoke unnecessarily. Everyone waited. Then MacArthur arrived. He entered without hurry. Without visible anger. Without any dramatic display. Yet the atmosphere immediately changed. People sat straighter. Conversation stopped. The room went silent. MacArthur reviewed the reports. Page after page. He read carefully. Occasionally making notes. Occasionally pausing. No one interrupted him. Minutes passed. Finally, he looked up. His face revealed nothing. What exactly happened? A colonel explained. Then another officer added details. Then a translator provided cultural context. MacArthur listened. Patiently. Calmly. When they finished, nobody spoke. Everyone waited for his reaction. Some expected anger. Others expected disciplinary measures. Instead, MacArthur remained silent. For several moments he simply stared at the reports. Then he stood. We will meet them ourselves. That was all he said. The meeting ended immediately. 2 days later, the Japanese officers returned. The same room. The same tables. The same tension. But this time something was different. Everyone knew who would be attending. American personnel lined the walls. Military police stood outside. Translators prepared their notes. Nobody knew what would happen. Then the door opened. MacArthur entered. The Japanese officers immediately recognized him. For the first time, visible uncertainty appeared on several faces. The room became perfectly still. MacArthur walked to the front. He sat. Folded his hands. And looked directly at the officers. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Several seconds passed. Then MacArthur nodded toward the senior Japanese representative. Good morning. The translator repeated the words. The officer replied. His voice was respectful. Professional. Careful. The discussion began. For nearly 20 minutes they spoke about reconstruction efforts. Food distribution. Infrastructure repairs. Local administration. Everything remained calm. Orderly. Controlled. Then MacArthur changed the subject. The room instantly sensed it. He looked toward the senior officer. I've received reports. The translator spoke. The Japanese officers listened. MacArthur continued. Reports that there have been concerns regarding certain customs. Nobody moved. The room felt smaller. The officer answered carefully. The translator repeated his words. There is no hostility intended. MacArthur nodded. I understand. Another pause. The officer continued. He explained tradition. Honor. Military culture. Generations of expectations. The Americans listened. The Japanese listened. Nobody interrupted. When he finished, silence returned. Then MacArthur leaned forward slightly. His voice remained calm. Almost gentle. Yet every person in the room focused on every word. I did not come to Japan to collect bows. The translator repeated the sentence. Several Japanese officers looked surprised. Several Americans looked surprised too. MacArthur continued. I did not come here to humiliate defeated men. The room remained silent. His voice never rose. War has already done enough humiliation. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed too loudly. The words settled over the room. Then he looked directly at the officers. But understand something. Another pause. The tension grew. Respect is not measured by how low a man bends his head. The translator repeated each word. MacArthur's gaze never wavered. It is measured by what he chooses to do afterward. The Japanese officers listened carefully. Some lowered their eyes. Others remained perfectly still. MacArthur continued. Your country is broken. No anger. No accusation. Just truth. Thousands are hungry. Another pause. Cities lie in ruins. The room remained frozen. The future of Japan will not be decided by gestures. He looked around the room. It will be decided by character. Silence. A long silence. The kind people remember for decades. Then something unexpected happened. The senior Japanese officer slowly stood. No one knew why. American guards instinctively stiffened. Several officers watched closely. The man faced MacArthur. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. The translator's voice trembled slightly as he translated. He says he understands. Another pause. The officer continued speaking. His voice sounded different now. Less formal. More human. The translator listened carefully. Then looked up. He says many of them believed surrender meant endless humiliation. Nobody interrupted. He says many feared they would never be treated with dignity again. The room remained silent. The officer continued. He says today's meeting changed that. Several Americans looked at one another. The atmosphere had shifted. Not dramatically. But unmistakably. Something hard had begun to soften. The officer finished speaking. Then he took a slow breath. And before anyone expected it, he bowed. Not deeply. Not dramatically. Just enough. A simple gesture. Voluntary. Unforced. The room watched in complete silence. Then another officer bowed. Then another. Not because they had been ordered. Not because they were pressured. Because they chose to. No American demanded it. No American celebrated it. Even MacArthur remained still. His expression barely changed. After several moments, he simply nodded. And the meeting continued. As though nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone present knew otherwise. When the officers eventually left the room, the atmosphere felt entirely different. The tension was gone. The bitterness had faded. Something important had occurred. Not a military victory. Not a political victory. A human one. Years later, participants would remember that day. Not because anyone shouted. Not because anyone threatened force. Not because anyone won an argument. They remembered it because dignity had defeated pride. Because respect had replaced resentment. Because one difficult conversation had accomplished what pressure never could. Sergeant Reed later reflected on the moment. I thought leadership meant making people obey. He shook his head. That day I learned leadership meant making people want to do the right thing. The war had created enemies. The peace required something harder. Understanding. Patience. Humanity. The officers who entered that room expecting humiliation left with something they never expected. Respect. And the Americans who expected confrontation discovered something equally valuable. That real strength is often quiet. Real authority rarely needs to shout. And lasting peace is built not through fear, but through dignity. Because sometimes the most powerful victory comes after the fighting has already ended. What would you have done? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more World War II stories where humanity, war, and difficult decisions collided, make sure to subscribe.